You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Kenneth Igbomo. On the show today, we'll be addressing inclusive growth. The World Bank's Gender Mainstreaming Strategy report highlights that the societies that discriminate by gender tend to experience less rapid economic growth and poverty reduction than societies that treat males and females equally. Our focus today is on the role of women in driving inclusive growth. You can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow my handle at Kenneth Igbomo. According to the World Bank, if African countries had closed the gender gap in schooling between 1960 and 1992, just as East Asia did, this would have almost doubled the per capita income growth in the region. Joining me to discuss the role of women in driving inclusive growth in Africa are Olubunmi Aboderin Salabi, the chairperson and the Executive Council of Women in Management and Business, WIMBIZ, and I also have Folusho Gbadamosi, who is the Director for Business Process and Technology at Prime Atlantic Group, and Chinwe Egwim, a macroeconomist at FBN Merchant Bank. A very interesting topic we're looking at here, inclusive growth and the role of women in there. I'd just like to start off by getting your thoughts, as WIMBIZ, on what this means to you when you hear a topic like this.
So at WIMBIZ, we have several programs. We have programs for women in management, women in business, and women in public service. One that's quite dear to my heart is called WIMBoard, and that's the program that's geared to get more women in leadership of companies. And WIMBoard is an advocacy platform that's actually experienced a measure of success. Like, for example, if you look at Women in Boards report that was done by Deloitte, the one that came out this year, you'll see that Nigeria is included in the 60 countries that Deloitte surveyed. And what excites me is that Nigeria is in the top 10 of countries that have inclusiveness in terms of women on boards. Number one is Norway, but Nigeria is at number 10. We have about 22% of women included in boards of companies. How did we get there? Little organizations such as WIMBIZ, we do what we can. We go around talking to different companies to let them know the benefits of having more women on their boards. So we made such a presentation when SLS was the central bank governor, and because of that, he instituted a legislation requiring banks to have 40% of women in leadership at board level and 30% at management level, or to that effect. And it has worked. So the banking industry is actually the shining star in Nigeria in terms of inclusive growth, because they have put into practice this legislation and they've included more women since that time in their leadership. And you can see that the banking industry is doing really well, and I like to think that it's because they reached out and they included more women in their decision-making process.
Folusho, I'd like to bring you in on this one. So interesting work they're doing at WIMBIZ. But when you look at the African workspace, what are the peculiarities you think is holding back more women from getting into C-suite positions?
I think that the peculiarities of the African workspace is actually probably more cultural. I think that a lot of African women, are still in this space where they've not really been able to fully express themselves, in the workplace because of so many cultural, nuances. I know lots of women still speak about balance. Balance is that word that I think everybody is so tired of hearing, but it's still an ever-pressing issue where people just don't know, how to kind of balance the home, how to balance the work. So they want to rise up in their career, but they're a bit concerned about, about their family. They're concerned about their children and kind of how to manage it all. In fact, I know that in recent times, banks actually, ironically, have started putting creches in their workplace, which is very, very, very helpful for a working woman. In fact, there's a lady at my organization, I don't work at a bank, but her husband works at a bank, and she goes there every day. Her son is at the creche there. She goes there, she feeds him, and she comes back to the office. And I think that really helps women, because knowing that your children will be fine, I think for most parents is, obviously it's quite a big deal. So I think that, it's an issue, but it's something that can be resolved if, as part of this whole, movement of trying to get more women in the corporate space, more women on boards, if we actually do things like, we put creches in the workplace, we have flexi hours. I mean, there's so many things going on worldwide. If you look at the global economy, most people are not doing the usual 9 to 5 anymore. There's flexi hours, and people are actually more efficient with that, because what then tends to happen is that people can manage their time. So I can imagine the average African woman, who is actually very, very hardworking. Most African women have a 9 to 5, they have a side business, they're doing so many things. Imagine having flexi hours, having creches at offices, there's no way that they would not thrive in such an environment.
Interesting points you mentioned there. So we're looking at culture and changing attitudes.
Yes.
Chinwe, I'd like to speak to you about more or less what you see the impact would be if we had a more fully inclusive society in Nigeria.
A more inclusive society would allow for girls to participate more with economic development. a ramp up in productivity, a closing in the unemployment gap because you're educating them and equipping them with skills that are required to fill up roles. There's also the part of population growth. So a slowdown in the population growth because more educated girls contribute to the conversation around birth controls and just family planning.
I would like to take a new dimension on this conversation and looking at leaving no one behind when we're talking about building inclusive societies.
Yes.
So I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think about that concept of leaving no one behind.
Well, to me, it's a no-brainer. Why would you field only half of your players in a football match? It's the same thing with a country. You have, in Nigeria, for example, almost 50%, the demographic, the figures are, are debatable, but almost 50% of our population are female. Why would you want to ignore an entire segment of your population and say, well, only this half are the ones that we're going to draw from? Why would you tie one hand behind your back and limit yourself? I wrote an article a couple of years back called Nigeria's Greatest Natural Resource. And the premise of my argument was essentially that women are Nigeria's greatest natural resource and that we need to do everything that we can to make sure that we carry everybody along. And you may think that, oh, well, we do that, girls go to school, boys go to school, and that is great. But what some researchers found is that if you look back at the public school system, particularly in rural areas, there was a higher drop-off rate of girls once they reached the age of puberty. And they searched to find why is it, and they discovered that it was because there were a lack of toilets in schools for girls, and when they started having their periods, they had to stay at home because it wasn't practical, and because of that, their education lagged behind. They were left behind. And then you also had the societal pressures, perhaps, family financial issues, and then also maybe some beliefs about maybe girls, are going to get married anyway, so why bother educating them? But what you are missing out on are people who are potential doctors, potential lawyers, potential solution providers, potential policymakers who need to not be left behind by doing simple things like having running water in public schools, or by providing, things that they would use for their personal hygiene. So in terms of leaving no one behind, we can actually do that in very small ways that would have a big impact in the future. Nigeria, again, I want to repeat that on the whole, Nigeria is actually on the right track. And Nigeria is doing pretty well in comparison to some other countries in Africa that maybe only have, say, 4% of their women in leadership or in decision-making circles. At least in Nigeria, we do have the legislation. Nationally, we have a national gender policy that says at least 35% of seats, in decision-making circles should be occupied by women. But, it's more like a suggestion rather than a law because it's not sort of actively enforced. So in terms of leaving no one behind, it would be great to have more light shine on our national gender policy so that more organizations, be they public sector or private sector, will actually adopt it, recognize the value of having more women in their management, in their leadership, and then follow through.
But I'm still sticking to this point of leaving no one behind. I'd like to take it also from a different angle now. Do you think we run the risk of losing out other segments of society in this drive for inclusion?
I think it is impossible for that to happen. And I'll tell you why. If you just look around the world and even look at the countries where this inclusion is happening, and it's happening very well, the men are still very, very much, in the background. They're very, in fact, not in the background, they're very much in the forefront.
In fact, if I
they are running things. Do you understand?
Even Norway, that is at the number one,
yes,
with over 40% of women in leadership, that still means that 60%
we still have 50%.
are men.
I don't think that we would ever get to the point where, well, maybe not in my lifetime, maybe it will happen. But I doubt that
we
in my
live
lifetime.
in hope.
We live in hope. But I doubt that we'll ever get to the point where men are suddenly now in the background, honestly. Because I think that there's just so many reasons why. I mean, some of the reasons, ironically, Mrs. Talabi already mentioned, even from an African perspective, we still have basic infrastructure problems and other problems that prevent women from just being able to be all that they can be, So honestly, I don't think that that's ever going to happen. I think that what is happening now is that I think because we have a lot of advocacy programs for women, I think suddenly some men are feeling like, what's going to happen to the men? But the truth is that if you really look around the world and you look at the statistics, the men are still at the forefront.
Okay, so Chinwe, I'll take you up on understanding the dynamics, affecting the African woman. Basically, we've on this platform already, we've talked about culture, we've talked about education. I would like to look at poverty, and the role and how women are being affected in that regard.
Poverty is affecting the African woman, especially with the mindset. I was lucky enough to attend a documentary series, I think it was 2 weeks ago, on what's going on in the eastern part of Nigeria. And you see there's like a gender role shift because of what's happened with the insecurity in the north. A lot of women have taken up the role of providing for families. And it's changed the dynamics of things. You see the men some of them are happy that their wives are able to support the family after what has happened to them, but some of them are allowing their ego get in the way. But the thing is, women are now being educated on how to run businesses, whatever kind of business, whether it's frying akara or making moi moi or creating hats or slippers to sell and help educate their children. When I say educate their children, send them to school for basic education in that area. So I feel like if you empower, and empowerment for me really is with education, if you educate women across boards, it would help with that whole lifting women from poverty, and it would help with adjusting the skewed level of growth, because it's really skewed. Like, inclusive growth is far, 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 far from being achieved in Nigeria. So I feel like if we empower women in the rural areas especially, we would see the desired impact that we're looking for.
Interesting contribution so far. I need you to hold that thought, and we'll take a quick break. When we return, we'll continue with the show. I've been speaking to Olubunmi Aboderin Talabi, the chairperson of and Executive Council of Women in Management and Business, WIMBIZ, Folusho Gbadamosi, Director for Business Process and Technology at Prime Atlantic Group, and Chinwe Egwim, a macroeconomist at FBN Quest Merchant Bank. As we continue our focus on the role of women in driving inclusive growth, still with me are Olubunmi Aboderin Talabi, the chairperson of the Executive Council of Women in Management and Business, WIMBIZ. I also have Folusho Gbadamosi, Director for Business Process and Technology at Prime Atlantic Group, and Chinwe Egwim, a macroeconomist at FBN Quest Merchant Bank. Very interesting conversations we've had so far in the first half. Now, I would like to take it to more around the benefits. I'd like you to speak to the benefits of women in development, and do you think we're making enough of the progress on the strong points that women give out when you look at growth of the economy?
When you asked that question, I'm reminded of a documentary I once saw of a farm in Kenya where they had male workers and female workers, and they were all picking, their output. And the men, as they were picking, they were eating it. And the women, as they were picking, they were putting it into jars. I don't know if you ladies saw that. They were putting it into jars. And the facilitator asked, what did we observe? And we said, okay, well, the men were eating as they were picking, and the women were putting theirs into the jars. So she said that this highlights the reason why foreign aid companies or general development organizations want to give money to women, because they feel that if they give money to women, they'll use it to take care of the children, educate the children, and so on and so forth, health benefits, and so on and so forth. So for me, when I think about the role of women in development, what I think of is building society. Human beings are all capable of good and bad, whether male or female. But what we tend to find is, though I hate to generalize, is that when you give women a particular type of responsibility, they think communally. Women are known to think communally and to think of, okay, so how can this benefit the community, or how can this benefit the family, and so on and so forth. So it's good to consider the different things that women bring to the table. And what I would say in this regard is that they look after people other than just themselves. So the multiplier effect of whatever you give them will go further.
Very interesting analogy there. Folusho, I'd like to take you up on how we can get women to achieve their full potential, more or less addressing how they can overcome the constraints that they face.
Okay. So I think as far as overcoming those constraints, I think that nowadays, fortunately, there's so many opportunities around us. And I think that it's all about leveraging them. I think gone are the days where you kind of just sit and whine. I'm not being sent on training. I can't go to school. There's schools online now. I know people who are learning skills online that I'm sure even 5-10 years ago was completely impossible, because they are taking advantage of online universities and online programs with a lot of free courses, actually, ironically. I also know that there's so many programs all over Nigeria, as an example, because I'm Nigerian, so I'll focus on Nigeria. WIMBIZ, as an example, has so many programs. Every month, there's a round table that anybody can attend. We have a flagship annual conference coming up, which is always an eye-opener for any woman that thinks, is it possible? Can I do this? Are there opportunities for me? Do I even have the capacity? Has anybody ever even done it before? That's the best place to be, because you literally see over 1,000 women who are doing amazing things in different industries. So you see women that are in careers, you see women that are running their own businesses, you see women that are in government and politics, and you just see, oh wow, so I can actually do this. And a lot of these women have stories, so it's never boring, because there's always so much depth to what they have done to overcome all the constraints and all the things that society tries to do to hold them back. I would also like to add something to what Mrs. Talabi said. I think it's very important as Africans and just as human beings in general that we know that everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Every gender has its strengths. Every gender has its weaknesses. If we're able to leverage the strengths of women and the strengths of men, this world would be a much better place, as opposed to just kind of focusing on why men, why women. Let's leverage all our strengths and see what comes out of that.
So picking up on that, leveraging on the strengths of women, we know the perceptions out there that women are better with managing money, women better at paying back loans, a couple of them out there. Chinwe, I'd like you to speak to access to finance for women, basically. Do you think we're seeing more women-specific products, or financial services being put out there?
Well, access to finance for SMEs as a whole is still a big challenge across the economy. For women, it's even worse. You have access to credit as high as 20% for most banks. And women, based on just cultural, issues or just tradition, women don't even have collateral, So I think that there's still a lot of work to do in that space with regards to access to finance for women, but there has been some efforts put out by the authorities, which I would say are laudable. The CBN has put out a lot of intervention funds. You have Bank of Industry that has done a lot as well in terms of focusing on women in client businesses. That's access to finance for women. And other programs, I'm going to mention WIMBIZ as well. Like there's a program called WIMCAP where you can get some funding from that. So in terms of access to finance for women, we can see there's a gradual shift, but we're not quite there. And yes, to what you said regarding women paying back loans, yes, that's true. We're seeing that as well. But I feel like the authorities, the banks, need to be a bit more open to giving women an opportunity.
So at last year's conference, we had a gentleman from the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund, and he spoke about the quantum of funds that they have available for small businesses to come and apply. And he lamented that he wasn't seeing women apply for these loans. But upon investigation, people in the crowd came up and they asked questions. They said, have you actually looked at the form? That the form is quite arduous, and they ask for some things that are difficult for women to get. And so they said that they would look at it again and rework it to make it more user-friendly. Sometimes if it seems as if women don't have access, it could be because of the process for getting those funds. If the process is improved, they'll find that more women will actually take up the funds that are available. And in some other places, in some other institutions, apparently they still ask women that they need to go and get permission from their husband, or they need to, bring land, or they need to go and call their father, or something like that. So until we culturally start to see women as human beings, as adults, capable adults, and treating them that way, when they apply for loans and things like that, we may still have the situation that we're having, but fortunately, we have progressive people in these different organizations who are looking on how to streamline the process to make it easier for women to have access to funds.
Folusha, I'd like to get to you asking, how much do you think we're losing as a continent from this gender disparity?
How much?
Yeah.
I don't think that it's quantifiable. I think trying to quantify would really be impossible, because I mean, all you need to do is just think about little instances, even in your life, maybe in your community, or maybe, you know, amongst your friends, or even in your workplace. If you're really being honest with yourself, you know that everybody brings different things to the table. I mean, I've sat in board meetings where the angle that the women bring is so different from the angle that men bring, and it all works together for good. So, for instance, when it comes to advertising certain products, right, you find that the way that a woman would receive it is very different from the way that a man would receive it. And most of these products, sometimes actually, the products that are more of general use are actually bought mainly by women. But you find that the decision makers are men. And so when they start including women in the decision making, they have more sales. Why? Because they are the ones that are using it, you know. So you are talking about Ariel or, you know, Omo or whatever, like washing soap. And it's mainly men that are driving it. Meanwhile, the people that are actually using it are women. You know, so I find that it's not really quantifiable, because we've actually seen, even locally, that even in little instances here and there, once you have a woman with her perspective, because once again, it's not about who's better or who's worse, it's just about different perspectives. And the fact that my experience and your experience is quite different, you know. So I don't really think that it's quantifiable.
Having said that, there's a professor at Oxford University called Linda Scott, Professor Linda Scott. She wrote an essay called The Economics of Exclusion. And she actually went out of her way to put figures to what the world is losing by not properly including women. And she looked at even non-financial aspects such as hunger, such as health matters, such as violence. And she showed empirically that if you improve the inclusion rate of women in decision making, if you empower women, make them more financially independent, they're less likely to be cases of domestic violence. If you want domestic violence to drop, empower women more, because they will have an option. And when the perpetrator knows that the woman has an option, he's less likely to try to beat her every time she does something that he thinks is irritating, and so on and so forth. So she said, in terms of all these things that society loses, it's because women are not properly included. So for anybody that's interested, they can download that essay online.
Chinwe, I'd like to still piggyback on this one and talk more broadly around investing in human capital, specifically how investing in health and education can move the needle for inclusion.
Health and education. So education, as I said earlier, is really an empowerment tool. And until we're able to get to all the nookies and crannies of this country or countries across Africa, we are just talking to ourselves. The fact that, again, GDP growth, we see it as high as 7% in some African countries. With Nigeria, it's approximately 3% right now. It's still skewed. And so education, financial education, vocational skills, basic education, just to help with empowering the youth, whether women or men, to get into the employment space. That would also assist. Health. With health, I feel like it's a big issue. If your mind is not right, if your body is not right, then it affects everything. So the socioeconomic impact of both education and health plays a very big role with economic development.
How can we, be more systematic in addressing these issues, especially around gender pay as well?
I'm going to go back to where I started off, which is this issue of legislation. If you look at Rwanda, for example, it's not only a beacon of hope in Africa. Countries across the world, look at what they've done. They deliberately increased the number of women that they had in parliament, making laws. I don't want to say the wrong figure, but it's very, very high. And as a result, well, you can say it's a coincidence, but there was a correlation in increase in their GDP. Now, because more women are in roles that matter, it is probable that they are also getting salaries that that matter. You know?
All right.
So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, you're right. Sometimes you could see a growth in GDP and it not translate to a better distribution of wealth. But what I would want to say is that let's at least make the start. Let's have legislation for more women to be included in decision-making levels, and let us see the improvement in GDP.
Thanks a lot for joining us on the show today. It's been a very, very interesting conversation. I've been speaking to Olubunmi Abodorin Talabi, the chairperson of the Executive Council of Women in Management and Business, WIMBIZ, and also Folusho Badamosi, Director for Business Process and Technology at Prime Atlantic Group, and Chinwe Egwim, a macroeconomist at FBN Quest Merchant Bank. And that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you for joining us. You can remember to watch all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website, cnbcafrica.com. Stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Igbomo. Do have a great day.